The day I found out my parents had stolen my future. I was standing in the financial aid office of my dream university, holding a thin white envelope in my hand, staring at numbers that made absolutely no sense. I remember every detail of that moment. The fluorescent lights above me buzzed softly. A printer somewhere behind the front desk kept making that mechanical clicking sound every few seconds. Students walked past me laughing in the hallway outside, completely unaware that my entire life had just split into two pieces. The life I thought I was going to have, and the life I was suddenly being forced to survive, because printed on that page, next to my name, was a number I never expected to see. 0. My college account balance was 0. Not low, not delayed, not frozen, gone, completely gone. And in that exact moment, before I even made the phone call, before I even drove home, before I even heard their excuses, deep down, I already knew who had done it. Because some betrayals do not begin in a single moment. Some betrayals begin years earlier, in small ways, quiet ways, ways that teach you slowly that your place in a family is not the same as everyone else's. My name is Claire. And before I tell you how one phone call destroyed everything my parents thought they could hide, you need to understand what it was like growing up in my house. Was actually new. That day was simply the first time the truth became impossible to ignore. I grew up in a quiet town in Ohio. The kind of town where everyone knew everyone. The kind of place where people waved from porches. Where summers smelled like cut grass. Where kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on. From the outside, my family looked normal. My father, Robert, was an accountant. Precise, organized, quiet. He was the kind of man who ironed his shirts the night before work. The kind of man who corrected restaurant bills if the server undercharged him by $3. The kind of man people described as dependable. My mother, Patricia, worked part-time at the public library. She loved appearing warm. She smiled easily around other people. Neighbors adored her. Teachers loved her. Church friends called her kind. And if you only saw her in public, you would probably think she was the perfect mother. And then there was my younger sister, Vanessa. Vanessa was 3 years younger than me. Blonde hair, bright smile, big personality. She could walk into any room and immediately become the center of it. And from the moment she was born, everything in our house changed. Some people say children imagine favoritism, that older siblings exaggerate, that resentment creates false memories. Maybe that happens in some families, but not mine, because in my family, favoritism was not subtle, it was not hidden, it was not accidental, it was obvious. It became the air I learned to breathe. I think the first time I truly noticed it, I was 7 years old. Vanessa was 4. School was starting in a week. My backpack had a broken zipper. The fabric was tearing near the straps. One of the buckles had snapped months earlier, and my father had tied it together with fishing line. I remember standing in the kitchen while my mother washed dishes. I held the backpack in both hands and said quietly, "Mom, I need a new backpack." She barely looked at me. She sighed, and she said, "Claire, we do not have money for unnecessary things right now. You can make this one last another year." I remember nodding, because that was what I always did. I nodded, I said okay, and I went upstairs. 2 days later, my mother came home from the store. Vanessa ran to the front door, and my mother smiled as she pulled out a bright pink backpack, brand new, custom stitched, Vanessa's name embroidered across the front in glitter thread. Vanessa screamed with excitement. My mother laughed. My father smiled, and I stood in the hallway, holding my broken backpack, watching all of them celebrate. Nobody looked at me. Nobody explained. Nobody even seemed to notice. And that was the first time I learned something important. In my family, there was one set of rules for Vanessa, and another set for me. I made honor roll for the 3rd year in a row. I came home carrying the certificate in both hands. I had worked for weeks, late nights, extra credit, perfect test scores. I was proud. I walked into the living room. My father was watching television. My mother was reading a magazine. I said, "I made honor roll again." My father glanced up. He smiled for less than a second and said, "Good job." Then he looked back at the television. That was it. No celebration, No hug, no special dinner, nothing. 3 weeks later, Vanessa got a B in art. Not even an a B. And my parents took her to her favorite restaurant. They ordered dessert. My mother posted photos. My father told relatives how creative Vanessa was. And I remember sitting in my room that night, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand what I had done wrong. That was the hardest part as a child. You don't immediately blame your parents. You blame yourself. You assume there must be something wrong with you, something missing, something invisible. Because children would rather believe they are unworthy than believe the people meant to love them simply choose someone else. And that belief can follow you for years. By the time I turned 16, I had stopped expecting fairness. I stopped asking for things. I stopped hoping. Instead, I started planning. Because somewhere along the way, I realized no one was going to build a future for me. So I would have to build one myself. I got a job at a diner just outside town. Nothing glamorous, sticky floors, coffee stains, long shifts, customers who snapped their fingers for refills. But it was mine. My first paycheck was $112. I still remember holding it in my hands, because that check meant something bigger than money. It meant independence. It meant possibility. It meant that maybe I could save enough to escape. And that became my routine. School during the day, diner at night, homework after midnight, weekends babysitting, tutoring neighborhood kids in algebra, saving every tip, every paycheck, every dollar. While other teenagers went to football games, I worked. While other girls went shopping, I worked. While other kids trusted their parents to help them later, I quietly prepared for the day mine wouldn't. And maybe the saddest part is, I did all of that without ever realizing just how right I was. By the time I graduated high school, I had saved $11,000. $11,000 at 18 years old, and I was proud of that. Proud in a way I had never allowed myself to feel before, because for once, I had built something no one could take credit for. It belonged to me. Every exhausted shift, every missed weekend, every sacrifice, mine. My father asked me to sit down at the kitchen table. That alone was unusual. My father did not do emotional conversations. He handled taxes, bills, schedules, practical things, not feelings. So when he folded his hands and looked at me seriously, I remember feeling nervous. He said, "Claire, your mother and I need to tell you something." My mother smiled from across the table. A soft smile. The kind of smile I had spent my whole childhood trying to earn. And then my father said words that changed everything. He said, "We've been putting money aside for your college since the day you were born." I stared at him. He continued, "There's a fund in your name, $85,000, and when you're ready for university, it's yours." I honestly don't think I breathed for several seconds. $85,000. It was more money than I had ever imagined anyone saving for me. For me, not Vanessa, me. And for one brief, dangerous, beautiful moment, I thought maybe I had been wrong. Maybe every missed celebration had meant nothing. Maybe every disappointment had been in my head. Maybe love in my family had simply looked different. Maybe my parents had cared all along, in the only way they knew how. I felt tears in my eyes, and I hated myself for crying, because part of me was still a child, desperate to believe I was loved. My mother reached across the table and squeezed my hand, and said, "We always believed in you." That sentence stayed with me for years, because later, I would realize people can lie with words, but sometimes the cruelest lies are the ones you want to believe the most. From that day on, I worked even harder, because now I thought I had a real chance, a future, a way out, a life. I applied to 7 universities. I spent months writing essays, filling out forms, chasing recommendations, working late, sleeping less, dreaming more. And when the acceptance letter came from Hartwell University in Boston, I cried all over again. Hartwell had one of the best pre-law programs in the country. It was competitive, prestigious, expensive. The kind of school people like me were not supposed to reach. But I got in. I got in. I remember standing in the kitchen with the letter in my hand, telling my mother, and she looked at me for a moment and said, "That's nice, honey, Then she smiled and added, "Vanessa passed her driving test today. We're taking her out to celebrate." And just like that, the moment disappeared. Again, like it always did. But this time I told myself it didn't matter. Because no matter how they acted, I had proof now. $85,000. A future waiting for me. A promise. And sometimes, the most dangerous thing in the world is not hatred. It's hope. Because hope can blind you long enough to walk straight into betrayal. And 6 weeks later, I walked into the financial aid office, expecting to begin my new life. Instead, I discovered my parents had already sold it. And the worst part, that wasn't even the moment that broke me. The moment that broke me was hearing the reason why. I remember walking into the financial aid office that morning, with a folder pressed tightly against my chest, and a future I still believed was waiting for me. Outside, the campus was alive. Students were laughing. Parents were carrying boxes into dorm buildings. Cars moved slowly through the crowded streets. Everyone around me seemed excited, hopeful, certain, and for a few minutes I let myself feel that way too. Because after everything, after years of working, saving, sacrificing, I believed this was finally the beginning of my life. Not survival, not endurance, life. The life I had spent years fighting for. Hartwell University was everything I had dreamed it would be. Old brick buildings, tall windows, stone walkways lined with trees. It looked like the kind of place where people became the version of themselves they were meant to be. And I wanted that more than anything. I wanted to believe that everything I had survived growing up had led me here. To that moment, to that campus, to the future that was finally mine. I walked into the financial aid office with all my paperwork organized in a neat blue folder. I had always been organized. You learn to become organized when nobody else in your life ever is. The woman behind the desk smiled when I approached. She looked to be in her late 50s. Kind eyes, silver glasses hanging from a chain around her neck, a coffee mug beside her keyboard that read, "World's Okayest Human." Under different circumstances, I probably would have smiled at that. She asked for my name. I said, "Claire Dawson." She typed it into the computer, then asked for my student ID number. I handed her the paper. She typed again. I stood there waiting. My heart was beating fast. But in a good way. That nervous excitement people feel when life is about to begin. And then something changed. Her expression shifted, only slightly, but enough. Her eyes moved across the screen, then back to me, then back to the screen. And suddenly, the air in the room felt different. She frowned gently and said, "I'm sorry, could you give me your full name again?" I smiled nervously. "Claire Dawson." She typed again, longer this time, more slowly. Then she adjusted her glasses and looked directly at me, and in a soft voice, she said words I still hear in my head sometimes when the room is too quiet. "Honey, I'm showing a zero balance." For a second, I didn't understand what she meant, because the sentence made no sense. Zero balance? No, that wasn't possible. There had to be a mistake, a system error, a wrong file, a different student, anything but that. So I laughed, a small nervous laugh. "What?" She turned the monitor toward me, and there it was, my name, my account, and next to the balance, a number so small it somehow felt bigger than anything I had ever seen. 0. Underneath that, another line, account closed. Closed 14 months earlier. I stared at the screen. My brain refused to process it. Because some truths are so painful, your mind protects you for a moment. Like if you just stare long enough, reality might correct itself. But it didn't. The number stayed there, cold, permanent, real. The woman behind the desk must have seen the color leave my face, because her voice softened. She said, "Would you like to sit down?" And that was when my knees nearly gave out. I sat in the chair beside her desk, because suddenly standing felt impossible. The room around me started sounding distant, like I was underwater. Phones ringing, printers running, students talking, all of it far away. muted. Nothing existed except that screen. Zero. My college fund, gone. Not reduced, not delayed, not frozen, gone. The woman asked quietly, "Did your parents discuss this with you?" And that question hit harder than the number itself. Because no, they hadn't. No warning, no conversation, no explanation, nothing. I shook my head, and for the first time in years, I felt like that little girl again, the one standing in the hallway, holding the broken backpack, watching someone else get everything. Only this time, it wasn't a backpack. It was my future. I somehow stood up. I thanked her. I don't even know why. Habit maybe. People like me learn to apologize even when we're the ones being hurt. I walked out of the office in a daze, through the hallway, down the steps, across the parking lot, and I don't remember any of it. I only remember standing beside my car, trying to breathe. Everything inside me was shaking. My hands, my chest, my stomach, my thoughts, all shaking. I pulled out my phone and stared at my father's contact. Dad, such a small word, 4 letters, a whole lifetime of disappointment inside one name. I called him. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, then he answered. His voice was casual, almost annoyed, like I had interrupted something. "Claire?" And for a second, I couldn't speak. Because there are moments when your whole life changes, and language feels too small to hold it. Finally I said, "Dad, the account is empty." Silence. I can still remember that silence, because sometimes silence tells you everything before words ever do. Then he exhaled slowly, and said, "Claire, we needed to use some of it." Some of it. I looked at the screen in my memory. 0. Some of it? No, that wasn't some of it, that was all of it. My voice shook when I said, "You used it." Another silence. Then he said, "We'll talk when you get home." And he hung up. He hung up, like my life had just been mildly inconvenienced. Like losing everything I had worked for was a scheduling issue. Like my future could wait until dinner. I stood in that parking lot staring at my phone, and in that moment, I think something inside me changed forever. Because pain is one thing, but realizing someone can destroy your future and still treat it like a minor interruption, that does something different to a person. I got in my car and drove home. No music, no radio, no sound except the road beneath the tires and my own heartbeat. The entire drive, I kept replaying his words. We needed to use some of it. Needed. That word haunted me. Needed for what? Medical bills? Emergency? Debt? Something terrible? Part of me still wanted to believe there was a reason. A real reason. Because even then, some broken part of me still wanted to believe my parents were better than I knew they were. I should have known better. When I pulled into the driveway, both of their cars were there. I sat in the car for almost 2 minutes, hands on the steering wheel, trying to prepare myself. But there is no way to prepare for betrayal from the people who raised you. I walked inside. My father was in his chair watching television. My mother was scrolling through her phone. And for one strange second, everything looked normal. Like the world hadn't just ended. Like they hadn't taken the future they promised me. Like nothing had happened at all. I stood in the doorway and said quietly, "Where is my money?" My father muted the television. My mother looked up slowly, and neither one of them looked surprised. That was the moment I knew. They had expected this. They had known this day would come. And somehow, they had still done it anyway. The silence in that room felt heavier than anything I had ever experienced. Not loud, not chaotic, just thick. Like the air itself didn't want to move. My father kept his hand on the remote. My mother slowly set her phone down beside her, and for a few seconds, no one spoke. I stood there, still holding my car keys in my hand, trying to understand how the same people who raised me could sit so calmly after taking everything I had worked for. Finally, my father cleared his throat and said, "Claire, sit down. Not I'm sorry, not we need to talk. Just sit down." Like this was a normal conversation, like this was just another evening. I didn't move. I stayed exactly where I was. And I said again, "Where is my money?" This time, my voice didn't shake. It was quiet, flat, controlled. And I think that's what made it different, because something inside me had already started to shift. My mother glanced at my father, the same look I had seen my whole life, the silent communication between them, the unspoken agreement. And then she spoke, soft, careful, like she was choosing each word to sound reasonable. "It's not what you think." I almost laughed. Not what I think? I had seen the account. I had seen the zero. There was nothing left to misunderstand. So I said, "Then explain it to me." My father leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and let out a slow breath, like this entire situation was exhausting for him, like I was the one creating a problem. He said, "About a year ago, Vanessa came to us with an opportunity." Opportunity. That word. I felt something tighten in my chest. He continued, "She wanted to travel, see the world, experience life outside this town. Paris, Rome, Spain, Greece." He listed the places like they were achievements, like he was proud. And then he said it, the sentence that made everything finally snap into place. She didn't have the money, so we helped her. I stared at him, and for a moment, I honestly thought I had misheard him. Helped her? So I said, "With what money?" And that's when my mother said it. Not my father, my mother, because she had always been better at softening the truth, at dressing cruelty in kindness. She said, "We used your college fund." Just like that. No hesitation, no apology, no shame. "We used your college fund." $85,000. Years of saving, years of believing, gone. Because Vanessa wanted to travel. I felt my fingers tighten around my keys, so hard it actually hurt. But I barely noticed, because something else hurt more, something deeper. I said slowly, "You took my future for her vacation." My mother immediately shook her head. No, no. It wasn't just a vacation. It was a life experience. She needed it. Needed. There was that word again. Needed. And before I could even respond, my father added, "You'll understand one day. Experiences like that shape people. They make them who they are." I looked at both of them, and in that moment, I realized something I think had been building my entire life. They genuinely believed they were right. This wasn't guilt. This wasn't regret. This wasn't a mistake. This was a decision they stood behind. I said, "What about me?" The question came out quieter than I expected, almost like a whisper, but it filled the entire room. "What about me?" My mother looked at me, and her expression softened in a way that almost made it worse, because it wasn't cruel. It wasn't angry. It was dismissive. "You're different. You've always been different. You're strong. You're responsible. You don't need things the way Vanessa does." That sentence stayed with me longer than anything else. "You don't need things." As if I wasn't human. As if I didn't have dreams. As if I didn't have limits. As if I didn't deserve the same chances. I felt something inside me go completely still. Not breaking, not exploding. Just still. And that's when I understood. This wasn't about money. It never had been. It was about value. And in their eyes, Vanessa was worth investing in. And I was expected to survive without it. My father leaned forward slightly and said, "Look, you can take out student loans. Lots of kids do it. You'll be fine. You always figure things out." That sentence, "You always figure things out," it was meant as reassurance. But all I heard was, "We never planned to help you. We never needed to, because you don't matter the same way." And suddenly, everything made sense. The backpack, the dinners, the celebrations, the silence, all of it. This wasn't new. This was just the biggest version of the same story. I looked at them one last time, and I realized something else. Arguing wouldn't change anything. Crying wouldn't change anything. Definitely wouldn't change anything. Because you can't convince people to value you if they've spent your entire life choosing not to. So I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I didn't fight. I just nodded once and said, "Okay." My mother looked confused. My father relaxed slightly, like they thought the conversation was over, like I had accepted it. like I would adjust, like I always did. But what they didn't understand was that okay didn't mean acceptance. It meant something else. It meant, I see you clearly now. For the first time. I turned around, walked up the stairs, and went into my room. The same room I had grown up in. The same walls, the same ceiling, the same place where I had spent years trying to earn something that was never coming. I closed the door behind me, sat on the edge of my bed, and stared at nothing. No tears came, not a single one, because something inside me had already moved past that. I wasn't heartbroken, I wasn't shocked, I wasn't even angry. Not yet. What I felt was clarity. Cold, sharp, unavoidable clarity. I understood exactly who they were, and more importantly, I understood exactly who I needed to become. Because in that moment, I made a decision. A real decision. Not emotional, not reactive, permanent. I would never depend on them again. Not for money, not for support, not for love, nothing. I would build everything myself, and I would build it so strong, so undeniable, that one day they would have no choice but to see exactly what they had thrown away. Not because I needed their approval, but because they needed to understand the cost of their choices. I stood up, walked to my desk, opened my laptop, and started looking at student loan options. Because the future they took from me was still mine. I would just have to fight harder for it. And as I sat there, filling out applications, running numbers, planning a life that suddenly became 10 times harder, one thought kept repeating in my mind. Not emotional, not angry, just clear. This is the last thing they will ever take from me. They just don't know it yet. 3 weeks later, I moved to Boston. Not with excitement, not with celebration, not with proud parents carrying boxes into a dorm room. I moved there alone. Everything I owned fit into the back of my car. 2 suitcases, a lamp, a box of books, and a future that suddenly came with interest rates. Most students arrived with families, mothers adjusting blankets, fathers carrying mini fridges, parents taking photos in front of campus buildings, smiling, laughing, proud. I watched them while I stood beside my car, pretending I didn't notice what was missing. No one hugged me goodbye. No one told me they were proud. No one said, "Call if you need anything." My parents had not even offered to come. My mother simply said, "Drive safe." And that was it. That was how I left home. And standing there in that parking lot, watching strangers give their children the love I had spent my entire life trying to earn, I made another promise to myself. I would stop noticing what I never had, because I would build something better. Hartwell was everything I imagined, and everything I feared. The classes were harder. The expectations were higher. The students around me seemed different, more confident, more prepared, more comfortable in a world I still felt like I had to fight to enter. Some of them came from money, real money, the kind of money that made tuition invisible, the kind of money that made failure survivable. I could always tell who they were. They walked through life like the ground would never disappear beneath them. I envied that more than I ever admitted, because when you grow up learning everything can be taken from you, you never fully relax. Not even when things are going well. I lived in a tiny apartment off campus with 3 other girls. The rent was barely affordable. The walls were thin, the heat worked when it felt like it, and the kitchen smelled permanently like burnt toast and cheap coffee. My bedroom was so small, I could touch both walls if I stretched out my arms, but it was mine, and somehow that mattered. I was building something without them. I worked mornings at the campus coffee shop, classes during the day, library at night, then waitressing on weekends. Every day blurred into the next. Wake up, work, class, study, repeat. I lived on instant noodles, rice, peanut butter sandwiches, whatever was cheapest. There were nights I fell asleep sitting at my desk, books still open, highlighter in my hand, too exhausted to even crawl into bed. And still, I kept going, because every time I wanted to quit, I remembered that screen. zero balance. That number became fuel. Every time I was tired, I remembered my mother saying, "You always figure things out." Every time I wanted to break, I remembered my father saying, "You'll be fine." And I decided they were going to be right, but not in the way they meant, because I was going to be more than fine. I was going to become impossible to ignore. My parents called sometimes, not often, just enough to pretend. Birthdays, holidays, occasional Sunday afternoons. And every call felt the same. My mother would spend 20 minutes talking about Vanessa, Vanessa's photography class, Vanessa's new boyfriend, Vanessa's latest idea, Vanessa's struggles, Vanessa's dreams. Then eventually she would say, "Anyway, how are classes?" Like I was an afterthought, like my life was a footnote after the main story. And every single time I said the same thing. "I'm good." Because I had learned something important. You cannot ask people for care they have already decided not to give. So I stopped asking. Vanessa came home from Europe 14 months later. My mother said she had found herself. Apparently, finding yourself involved expensive hotels in Italy, wine in France, and beaches in Greece, paid for by someone else's future. She moved back into my parents' house, started taking photography courses online. And my parents bought her a professional camera. $3,000. My mother told me that like it was wonderful news. I remember standing in a grocery store, holding a basket with discounted soup in it, listening to her say, "She finally knows what she wants to do with her life." And I almost laughed, because I was standing there, calculating whether I could afford shampoo that week, while they were still financing her dreams. But instead of anger, I felt something else, distance. Because slowly, without realizing it, I was becoming someone they no longer recognized. And that turned out to be the most dangerous thing of all. My second year at Hartwell, something changed. I stopped trying to survive and started learning how to win. There's a moment in some people's lives when pain stops weakening them and starts sharpening them. That was mine. I became relentless. I sat in the front row, asked harder questions, stayed later, prepared more. While other students wanted good grades, I wanted control, because control was something I had never had. And now that I was building it, I wasn't letting go. Professors noticed. One of them stopped me after class and said, "You don't work like someone trying to pass. You work like someone trying to escape." I smiled, because he was right. I wasn't building a career. I was building freedom. By my final year, I graduated near the top of my class. Not because I was the smartest, but because no one was willing to work harder than I was. And a month before graduation, I got the call, an offer from Hartwell and Morrison, one of the best firms in Boston, prestigious, competitive, impossible. The kind of job people dream about. The kind of job people like me were never supposed to get. I sat in silence after the call ended, staring at the wall. I let myself feel it. Pride. Real pride. Not because someone gave me something, because I earned it. Every brutal shift, every lonely night, every sacrifice, every betrayal, it had all led there. So I called home. Not because I needed their approval, maybe just because some small part of me still wanted it. My father answered. I told him I got the job, at one of the best firms in the city. There was a pause, and then he said, "That's good." Then without missing a beat, he added, "Vanessa got engaged last week. We may need some help with wedding costs." I closed my eyes, and suddenly, something inside me stopped hoping forever. Because there it was again. Even at my biggest moment, I was still just the person expected to give. I said quietly, "Congratulations to Vanessa," and I hung up. Then I sat there in my apartment, staring at the phone, and for the first time, I smiled. Not because it was funny, because it was clear, painfully clear. I had spent my whole life waiting for them to change, and now I finally understood. They never would. And strangely, that realization set me free, because once you stop waiting for love, you stop giving people the power to hurt you with its absence. I started at the firm 2 weeks later. I knew I belonged there. The work was intense, the hours were brutal, the pressure was constant. But unlike home, effort actually mattered there. Results mattered. Discipline mattered. Excellence mattered. And for the first time in my life, I was in a world where people noticed what I did, not who someone else was. I was the first one in every morning, last one out at night. I took assignments no one else wanted, read cases no one else bothered to read, prepared twice as hard as everyone around me, and slowly, people started noticing. Partners learned my name, senior attorneys asked for me, and for the first time, I was no longer invisible. By my third year, I was handling cases on my own. By my fourth, I had become the youngest associate in the firm's history to lead a major corporate fraud file. And every single morning, when I sat down at my office desk, I remembered the same thing. Zero balance. Because the people who tried to break me had accidentally created someone they could never control again. And then, just when I thought I had finally built a life no one could shake, my phone rang one Tuesday morning, and everything changed again. By the fourth year of my career, my life looked nothing like the one my parents thought I would have. I had my own apartment in Boston, floor-to-ceiling windows, a quiet view of the city, shelves filled with books I had bought myself, furniture I chose myself, a life I built myself. And every now and then, usually late at night, I would stand by the window, looking down at the lights below, and think about the girl who once sat in a financial aid office, staring at a zero balance, believing everything had been taken from her. Because the truth was, they had taken the easy version of my future. But they had not taken me. And maybe that made all the difference. Around that same time, I met Daniel. He was nothing like anyone I had ever known. Calm, steady, quiet in a way that felt safe. He worked in financial law in New York. We met at a legal conference in Chicago. A crowded hotel ballroom. Too much noise, too many forced conversations. And somehow, in the middle of all of that, he felt like silence. The kind of silence that makes you feel understood. We talked for hours that night, then again the next day, then every day after that. And for the first time in my life, someone chose me without hesitation. No comparison, no conditions, no making me feel like I had to earn my place. Me. Daniel loved me in a way I had never experienced before. Consistently, quietly, without performance. And the strangest part was, I didn't know what to do with that at first. Because when you've spent your whole life being emotionally rationed, real love can feel unfamiliar, almost suspicious. But he stayed, patient, kind, certain. And a year later, he asked me to marry him. I said yes before he even finished asking. Because for the first time, I wasn't choosing survival. I was choosing peace. Our wedding was small, simple, beautiful. Nothing extravagant, nothing performative. Just people who actually loved us. My parents came. Of course they did. They sat quietly in the third row. My mother smiled for photos. My father shook Daniel's hand. Vanessa arrived late, left early, and somehow, even on my wedding day, they still felt like distant guests in my life. But by then, that no longer hurt. Because people can only break your heart with absence if you're still waiting for them to show up. And I wasn't anymore. Then 6 months after the wedding, everything changed. It was a Tuesday morning, cold outside, rain against the office windows. I was sitting at my desk reviewing contracts when my phone rang. Unknown number. Boston area code. I would have ignored it. But something made me answer. A man's voice came through the line. Professional, measured, calm. He introduced himself as a senior investigator at a regional bank. Then he said my full name. Claire Morrison. Formerly Claire Dawson. And immediately, something inside me tightened. He said, Ms. Morrison, you are not in trouble, but we believe you may be the victim of financial fraud. My entire body went still. The office around me disappeared. Noise faded. Time slowed. And suddenly, I was 18 again, standing in that financial aid office, staring at zero. He explained that the bank had been reviewing irregular account closures. During that review, They found my college account, the one my parents had emptied, the one I had spent years trying not to think about. And what they discovered changed everything. Because under the legal structure of that account, once I turned 16, I became a co-owner, not just the beneficiary, a legal co-owner, which meant the account could not be closed without my signature. And according to the bank's records, my signature had been there. Only one problem: I never signed anything. Someone had forged my name. And deep down, before he even finished speaking, I already knew who had done it. My father. The same man who balanced every checkbook down to the penny. The same man who knew exactly what signatures meant. The same man who looked me in the eyes and said, "You'll figure something out." I sat there in silence, my hand gripping the phone, and asked the only question that mattered. "Are you telling me what they did was a crime?" The man paused. Then he said, "Yes." And just like that, the story I had spent years trying to survive became something else. Not just betrayal, evidence. Not just pain, fraud. Not just family history, a case. And because I was a lawyer, I understood immediately what that meant. Forgery, financial fraud, civil liability, criminal exposure, real consequences. For the first time in my life, the damage they caused could not be explained away with family excuses. For the first time, there was a record, a paper trail, proof. And suddenly they weren't just parents who had hurt me. They were people who had broken the law. I should tell you something. It wasn't the money. By then, I didn't need the money. Daniel and I were comfortable, successful, stable. I had built a life they could never have imagined. I didn't need $85,000, but I needed something else. I needed the truth to finally have weight. Because some wounds don't heal until the people who cause them are forced to see them. So I built the case. Quietly, methodically. Every account record, every signature, every transfer, every document, every timeline. I worked on it that night, at the kitchen table, long after Daniel had gone to bed. He never pushed, never asked too much. He just sat beside me sometimes and held my hand. Because he knew, some battles are old, and some healing has to be chosen. 3 weeks later, I handed everything to a criminal attorney I trusted. He reviewed the file, then looked at me and said, "Claire, this is strong. Very strong. If you move forward, they could lose everything." And for a long moment, I just stared at the file. Because that was the moment that mattered. Not the fraud, not the money, the choice. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't the powerless daughter anymore. I was the one holding the future, the same way there once had. And I realized something. I didn't want revenge. Not really. I wanted accountability. There is a difference. Revenge wants pain. Accountability wants truth. And after a lifetime of being treated like my pain didn't count, truth mattered more. So I said, "File it." I drove home one last time. The same house, the same driveway, the same front porch. Only this time, I wasn't arriving as their daughter. I was arriving as the consequence. My mother opened the door, and the second she saw my face, she knew. Inside, my father sat in his chair, Vanessa on the couch, phone in hand, exactly where they had been years earlier, like time had frozen for them, while I had been forced to evolve. I sat down, looked at all three of them, and said, "The bank called me." No one spoke. I continued. They found the forged signature. Still silence. Then my father whispered, "Claire?" And for the first time in my life, I interrupted him. "No, you don't get to explain this anymore." I looked directly at him and asked, "Did you sign my name?" He stared at the floor, and that silence was the closest thing to an apology I would ever get. My mother started crying, actual tears, and said, "We never thought." I held up my hand and said, "I know. That was the problem. You never thought about me at all." Vanessa finally looked up, really looked at me, maybe for the first time in her life. And I think in that moment, even she understood. because this was no longer family dysfunction. This was consequence. I told them the truth. The bank had given them a choice: repay everything, or face criminal charges. My father looked older in that moment than I had ever seen him, smaller, and he asked, "You're really doing this?" I looked at him calmly and said, "No. You did this years ago. I'm just the first person who's finally making you face it." 10 days later, the money was returned. Every dollar, 85,000, plus interest, plus legal fees, transferred into my account. But the money wasn't what changed me. The silence after was, because after that, they stopped calling. No more holidays, no more birthdays, no more pretending. And strangely, that felt like peace. Weeks later, my father called once. Just once. I answered, and he said, "Was it really worth destroying this family over money?" I closed my eyes, and after everything, after all those years, I finally said the one thing I had needed him to hear. "No, you destroyed this family the day you decided my future mattered less than her vacation." Then I hung up, and that was the last time I ever spoke to him. Daniel and I used part of that money as the down payment on our first home, not because I needed it, but because I wanted something beautiful to come from something painful. And sometimes, late at night, I still think about that girl in the financial aid office, the girl who thought her life had ended. She didn't know it yet, but that was the day everything truly began. Because sometimes, the people who try to break you accidentally show you exactly how strong you've been all along. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can ever do is stop asking people to love you and let them live with what they did instead.